It starts with a sound most people never think about, the click of handcuffs, that cold mechanical snap of steel closing around a wrist. It is a sound that carries weight far beyond its small size. And on a quiet October evening on Weston Terrace in the affluent suburb of Harlan County, Ohio, that sound cut through the still air like a blade. A man stood in his own driveway, his face pressed against the hood of his own car, his wrists bound behind his back, his neighbors watching from their porches' phones raised recording. The two officers who put him there were convinced they had just caught a brazen burglar. They were proud of themselves. They had no idea, because when the name Marcus Webb crackled over the police radio, the chief of police did not walk to his cruiser. He ran. He ran out of a steakhouse, leaving his dinner half-eaten and a $20 bill on the table. He ran to his SUV and drove through 3 red lights. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the wheel, because these two officers had not just handcuffed an innocent man. They had handcuffed the one person in the entire state of Ohio with the authority, the credentials, and the iron will to dismantle their entire department from the inside out. And he had been in Harlan County for exactly 4 days. Marcus Webb had spent 51 years learning how to be still. Not passive, not submissive, still. There's a difference that most people never understand, and it is a difference that had saved his life more than once. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped silver at his temples, and a face that had absorbed 2 decades of courtrooms, crisis rooms, and corrupt precincts without losing its fundamental composure. He had grown up in Cleveland, the son of a postal worker and a schoolteacher raised to believe that excellence was armor. That if you worked hard enough, prepared thoroughly enough, dressed well enough, spoke precisely enough, the world would eventually have no choice but to see you clearly. He believed that for a long time. Then he went to law school. Then he joined the Department of Justice. Then he spent 22 years walking into cities where black men and women had filed complaint after complaint after complaint, only to watch those complaints disappear into filing cabinets, dismissed by internal affairs divisions that existed to protect the badge, not the public. Marcus had seen what happened when power went unaccountable. He had seen it in Detroit, where a precinct commander had run a shakedown operation, targeting small business owners for 17 years. He had seen it in Baltimore, where evidence lockers had been methodically plundered and the losses papered over with falsified records. He had seen it in St. Louis, where a pattern of racially targeted traffic stops had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees and fines that flowed quietly back to connected contractors. He had dismantled all 3. Now, the Ohio Attorney General had sent him to Harlan County. The referral file was 40 pages thick. Use of force complaints up 39% in 3 years. Traffic stop disparities that defied every statistical explanation except one. An internal audit the Kessler Report conducted 18 months ago and then quietly buried by the man at the top. Marcus had read every page on the drive from Columbus. He had not yet opened the sealed follow-up file sitting on his desk. He wanted to observe the department first. Raw. Unfiltered. The way it operated when it believed nobody important was watching. He had moved into 14 Weston Terrace on a Tuesday, 4 days ago. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial with a deep front porch and a wide driveway that curved gently toward a 2-car garage. It was rented through the Attorney General's office under a corporate lease, the arrangement handled privately, deliberately, quiet. On his first morning, before he unpacked a single box, Marcus installed a commercial-grade doorbell camera system. Not because he was afraid, because 22 years of federal work had made documentation as natural to him as breathing. He placed a sealed folder on the desk in the study, labeled in his own handwriting, HCPD, Internal Audit, Preliminary Findings. He had not opened it yet. He told himself he would know when the time was right. He had no idea how quickly that time would come. On the evening of the fourth day, Marcus stepped outside to retrieve a grocery delivery left at the edge of his driveway. The air was crisp, carrying that particular October sharpness that smells faintly of dried leaves and cold coming. The porch light was on. The street was quiet. A neighbor, 2 houses down, was raking leaves. A child's bicycle was tipped on its side at the end of a driveway across the street. Marcus picked up the paper bag, turned toward the house, and touched the biometric keypad. The light blinked amber. He pressed his thumb again. Amber again. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He had used the keypad maybe a dozen times since moving in. It had worked fine every other time. He crouched down, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and retrieved the small multi-tool he had carried for 15 years. Every federal building he had ever worked in had a door that jammed at the wrong moment. He had stopped being surprised by it a long time ago. He found the seam on the rear battery panel and pressed the flat edge of the tool against it. He was not hurrying. He was not frantic. He was a man in a cashmere sweater and dark trousers crouching on the porch steps of his own home, solving a minor mechanical inconvenience with the calm efficiency of someone who had solved far larger problems in his life. He did not notice the curtain moving across the street. Sandra Plum had lived on Weston Terrace for 23 years. She was 65 years old, retired, and devoted to the Harlan County Neighborhood Watch program with the kind of focused energy that had no other real outlet. She was not a cruel woman, not exactly. She was the kind of woman who told herself she was protecting something. She never examined too carefully what it was she was actually protecting, or why certain people made her reach for her phone while others did not. She had not been home when the moving trucks arrived over the weekend. She had been visiting her sister in Cincinnati. When she came back, she noticed a light on in the Henderson house, the one that had been sitting empty since the Hendersons relocated to Florida. She had been watching it since. On this October evening, she saw a large black man in dark clothing crouching at the front door of that house with a tool. She did not walk across the street. She did not knock on the door of the neighboring houses to ask if anyone knew who this was. She did not consider that the house might have been sold or rented. She did not consider any explanation that required her to revise her first impression. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was low and urgent as she described what she was seeing. A break-in in progress, she said. A suspicious male at the front door, a tool being used on the lock. She said it all without hesitation, without doubt, with the settled confidence of a woman who believed she was doing exactly the right thing. The call was routed to dispatch, and the nearest available unit was Patrol Car 47. Officer Dale Pruitt had been with the Harlan County Police Department for 8 years. He was 38 years old, thick through the neck and shoulders, with a face that defaulted to a kind of irritable skepticism that he had long since stopped distinguishing from authority. He gripped the steering wheel of Patrol Car 47 the way some men grip things when they feel the world is not giving them enough respect. His record was an object lesson in institutional protection. 17 excessive force complaints in 8 years. 17. 9 of them filed by Black residents. 4 by Latino residents. The remaining 4 by white residents whom Pruitt had decided for various reasons did not belong where he found them. Every single one of those complaints had been cleared by the department's Internal Affairs Division, not because the complaints lacked merit, but because Union President Ron Vickers had been present at every single review, and because Chief Warren Stokes had made it quietly clear that officers who produced high stop numbers and maintained their clearance rates were officers worth protecting. Pruitt knew all of this. He operated accordingly. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Officer Nathan Cole, 26 years old and 3 months out of the academy. Cole was still in the stage of his career where he noticed everything and said almost nothing. He had filed every experience with Pruitt into a growing internal archive that he did not yet know what to do with. Tonight, 2 blocks before the dispatch call came through, Pruitt had been in the middle of a monologue that Cole had come to dread. It was about neighborhoods, about who belonged where, about how you could tell Pruitt said with the practiced certainty of a man who had never once questioned his own instincts just by looking, just by paying attention, just by knowing the area. Cole stared out the passenger window and said nothing. He had learned that saying nothing was not the same as agreeing. He told himself that. He told himself that a lot. The dispatch call crackled through. Burglary in progress. 14 Weston Terrace. Pruitt's face changed immediately, that flat irritability sharpening into something that looked almost like excitement. He hit the gas. 2 blocks from Weston Terrace, Pruitt ran the plate on the vehicle registered to the address. It came back to a Marcus A. Webb, Columbus address. No warrants, no flags. Pruitt noted it and said nothing to Cole. He filed it away and kept driving. Marcus had just succeeded in releasing the rear panel of the keypad when the spotlight hit him. It came without warning, cutting across the porch in a blinding sweep of white, casting sharp, elongated shadows against the brick facade of the house. The screech of tires followed immediately, a cruiser coming in too fast, jumping the curb at the base of the driveway, stopping at an aggressive angle that said everything about the disposition of the man behind the wheel. Marcus turned slowly. He shielded his eyes against the glare. He could see 2 silhouettes climbing out of the vehicle. He could see their hands moving to their holsters. His pulse spiked the way it always did in these situations, a physiological fact he had long since learned to acknowledge without allowing it to change his behavior. He had been in threatening environments before. He had stood in rooms with men who meant to harm him. He had navigated situations where one wrong movement could end everything. He knew what to do with the spike. He breathed through it. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, visible. He raised both hands to chest-height, palms open, facing forward. "Good evening, officers," he said. His voice was calm and resonant and steady. "There is no problem here. I am just fixing my lock." "Step away from the door," Pruitt barked, advancing up the walkway. His taser was out. His posture was the posture of a man who had already decided what kind of situation this was. Cole flanked to the right, his hand on his sidearm, his eyes moving between Marcus and his partner with a look that Marcus, even in this moment, recognized as discomfort. "I am the homeowner," Marcus said, taking one slow step down from the porch. "My name is Marcus Webb. I live here. My identification is in my jacket's inner pocket." Pruitt scoffed. It was a short, ugly sound. "Yeah, sure you do. Get down the stairs, all the way down." Marcus complied, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Officer," he said, "I am complying with your directions, but I need you to understand that I have identified myself. I have offered my identification, and I am standing on property I own." "You don't give the orders here," Pruitt said. He closed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and grabbed Marcus's left arm with the kind of force that serves no functional purpose except to establish dominance. Marcus was a large man. He did not topple easily. His frame absorbed the pull without stumbling, which Pruitt immediately interpreted as resistance. "Stop resisting," Pruitt said loudly. "I am not resisting." Marcus replied, his voice steady but now firm. "You are assaulting me on my own property." Cole moved in, grabbing Marcus's other arm, not because he had assessed the situation and determined it was necessary, but because that was what the training said to do when your partner told you someone was resisting. Together, the two officers moved Marcus off the porch steps and shoved him forward into his own driveway. The hood of the car was cold. Marcus felt the metal against his cheek, felt the pressure of Pruitt's knee in his lower back, heard the familiar sound of handcuffs being unclipped from a duty belt. He did not fight it. He knew the statistics. He knew with the clarity of someone who had spent 2 decades studying exactly this kind of moment, how quickly a misunderstanding could cross a line that could not be uncrossed. He kept still. He kept breathing. And beneath the stillness, something settled into place. Not fear. Not humiliation, though humiliation was there too, a physical weight on his chest. What settled was certainty. Pruitt was talking, announcing the arrest, reciting charges: attempted burglary, trespassing, resisting. The words floated past Marcus like noise. He turned his head enough to look at Cole. The young officer was standing 2 feet away, holding Marcus's wallet, which he had retrieved from the jacket pocket. He was staring at the driver's license under the dim light of the cruiser's headlights. Nathan, Marcus said quietly. His voice was very calm. Look at the card behind the license. Cole heard him. He pulled the card. It was silver-edged official weight bearing the seal of the state of Ohio in raised embossing that caught the light. Below the seal, in clean block letters, Marcus A. Webb, Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Director, Office of the Ohio Attorney General. Cole's face did something complicated. Higgins, he started. Pruitt, Marcus said quietly, correcting the name without raising his voice. Pruitt snatched the card from Cole's hand. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he slipped it into his vest pocket. He did not announce it on the radio. He did not hold it up for the neighbors recording from their porches. He did not let Cole see where he put it. You're under arrest, Pruitt said, and the steel clicked shut around Marcus's wrists. Cole pressed the button on his shoulder radio to call it in. His voice was unsteady in a way he could not entirely control. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. One in custody at 14 Weston Terrace. Suspect is secured. Requesting transport. Copy 47. Name on the suspect. Cole looked at Pruitt. Pruitt grabbed his own radio. Suspect is giving the name Marcus Webb, probably an alias. We're bringing him in for processing. There was a pause. A long one. Long enough that Pruitt frowned. Unit 47, please repeat the suspect's name. Pruitt spelled it out impatient, dismissive, and the voice on the other end went very quiet for a moment. When it came back, something had changed in it entirely. Unit 47, hold your position. Do not transport. Do not move. The chief is getting on the line. Pruitt stared at his radio. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him, and for the first time that night, Pruitt saw something in the young officer's face that he did not like. It was not fear. It was recognition. Chief Warren Stokes had been the head of the Harlan County Police Department for 9 years. He was 57, heavyset, with the look of a man who had once been genuinely athletic and had spent the better part of a decade slowly becoming something else. He ran his department the way certain men run things when they believe that loyalty is the highest virtue, and accountability is just a word used by people who have never had to make real decisions. He had not built a corrupt department. That was what he told himself. He had built a loyal one. There was a difference. He believed there was a difference. The Kessler report had been the moment he made his choice. 18 months ago, an internal auditor named Kessler had produced a 50-page review documenting the disappearance of $67,000 from the department's evidence locker. The trail led clearly to 2 of Stokes's senior captain's men who had been with him since the beginning. Men whose loyalty he had counted on, cultivated, and rewarded for nearly a decade. Kessler had flagged it. Kessler had documented it. Kessler had put it in a report and handed it to the chief. Stokes had buried it. He had cited inconclusive findings. He had transferred Kessler to a lower-profile assignment. He had told himself he would revisit the matter when the timing was better. The timing was never better. So the report sat in a locked drawer in his office, and the two captains continued to run their divisions. And Stokes continued to tell himself that he was a good man, who had made one difficult call in a long career of difficult calls. On this October evening, he was sitting in a corner booth at Brennan's Steakhouse celebrating with Ron Vickers, the union president, and two city council members who had just helped ensure that a favorable internal affairs ruling cleared 3 officers who probably should not have been cleared. It was a good evening. The kind of evening that made 9 years of difficult decisions feel worth it. His radio was clipped to his belt. He usually ignored standard dispatch traffic during dinner. The watch commander handled it. He was in the middle of a sentence when the dispatcher patched through directly. He heard the address first, 14 Weston Terrace. He frowned, setting down his glass. He knew that address. 2 days ago, the Ohio Attorney General had called him personally, not through staff, personally. The call had been brief and explicit. The state was sending a federal enforcement director to Harlan County. The man was relocating quietly, beginning a deep audit. The AG had not given a name. He had given the address of the residence, Weston Terrace. He had said it in a tone that made very clear that any incident involving that address would be treated as a direct reflection on the department's cooperation with the state. Stokes had hung up and immediately increased his antacid intake. Now the address was coming through on his radio, and then he heard the name, Marcus Webb. The booth felt like it tilted sideways. Stokes did not reach for his radio, not immediately. He stared at the table for 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds his mind ran through every possible version of what was happening. Every single version ended the same way. He was out of the booth before the 3rd second was up. He threw money on the table without counting it. He was through the door of Brennan's at a pace that was nearly a run. He had his keys in his hand before he reached the parking lot. He was in his unmarked SUV with the emergency lights on and the siren wailing before Ron Vickers had even stood up from the booth. Vickers watched him go. Then Vickers picked up his phone and called Pruitt. Pruitt did not answer. Vickers called again. Pruitt still did not answer. Vickers set the phone down slowly on the table and stared at the uneaten food in front of him, and understood with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his career managing other people's disasters that something had just gone very badly wrong. The neighborhood was still. Marcus stood in his own driveway, hands cuffed behind him, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of Patrol Car 47. Several neighbors had come out onto their porches. He could see the glow of phone screens in the dim light. Some faces looked concerned. Some looked confused. One face across the street wore an expression of quiet satisfaction. The woman in the cardigan was standing at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, watching the police handle what she had reported. Marcus did not look at her for long. He looked at Nathan Cole. The young officer was standing a few feet away, his body angled in a way that suggested he did not entirely know what side of this scene he was standing on. Marcus said his name quietly. "Cole," he said, "look at what your partner put in his vest." Pruitt heard it. "Shut up," Pruitt said. But it was a different kind of shut up than before. Quieter. Less certain. Marcus looked directly at Pruitt then. His voice dropped an octave, carrying a calm authority that made Cole take a small involuntary step back. "Officer," Marcus said, "I have given you one warning. I am giving you a second." My name is Marcus Webb. You can verify it right now through dispatch. You can look at the card you put in your vest pocket. You have, I would estimate, about 3 minutes before whatever is happening on that radio becomes a defining event of your professional life." Pruitt laughed. It was short and dismissive, and not quite as confident as he intended it to sound. "Are you threatening me?" "I am informing you," Marcus said simply. Pruitt took a step closer, positioning himself within Marcus's line of sight close enough to make the intimidation obvious. "You know how many loudmouths I've dealt with over 8 years? Every single one of them thought they had something on me. Every single one of them was wrong." Marcus held his gaze without flinching. "I am not a loudmouth," he said. "I'm a man who understands exactly how this system works. And you, officer, have just made a catastrophic error." The radio crackled. This time it was not dispatch. "Unit 47, this is Chief Stokes." His voice was barely controlled. A thin membrane of professionalism stretched over something that sounded like panic. "Do not move. Do not put that man in a vehicle. Do not speak to him. If you have a hand on him, take it off right now. I am 4 minutes out. You hold your position. Do you copy?" The street went very quiet. Pruitt stared at his radio. Cole had gone pale. From across the driveway, one of the recording neighbors said something to another in a low voice that neither officer could quite make out. Marcus said nothing. He waited. The siren that came down Weston Terrace 4 minutes later did not sound like a routine response. It had the quality of urgency of something barely contained a sound that made people step back from their porches and grip their phones a little tighter. The black Ford SUV came around the corner at a speed that was excessive for a residential street at dusk, and it stopped in a way that communicated everything about the state of the man behind the wheel. The front wheels were half on the grass. The vehicle was parked at an angle. The door opened before the engine was fully off. Chief Warren Stokes looked the way a man looks when he has spent 4 minutes in a car watching his entire career replay itself in his head. His tie was crooked. His face was a mottled, unhealthy color. His breathing was audible from 15 feet away. He did not look at Pruitt. He did not look at Cole. He walked directly to Marcus Webb. He stopped in front of him. He looked at the steel cuffs biting into Marcus's wrists. He looked at the scuff mark along Marcus's jaw where his face had met the hood of the car. He looked at the torn edge of the cashmere sweater at the shoulder where Pruitt's grip had pulled it out of shape. Stokes closed his eyes. He held them closed for 1 full second. Then he looked at Cole. "The key," Stokes said. His voice was very low. Cole produced it immediately, clearly relieved to have something useful to do. Stokes took the key. He stepped around behind Marcus and inserted it into the cuffs with hands that were not steady. The steel released. Marcus brought his arms forward slowly. He rolled his wrists. The red indentations circling them were deep and visible in the porch light. He turned to face the chief. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Chief Stokes," he said. Stokes looked like a man who had swallowed something that was working its way down the wrong pipe. "Sir," the chief said, and the word came out choked. "My God, I am so sorry. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am." Marcus adjusted the cuff of his sweater. "I am Marcus Webb," he said clearly, for the benefit of the recording phones as much as for the chief. "Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Director, Office of the Ohio Attorney General. I moved into this house 4 days ago. I was fixing a jammed keypad on my own front door." Stokes closed his eyes again. There was a sound from across the driveway. A voice bright with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet understood that everything has changed. "Well, it is about time." I was beginning to wonder how long this was going to take. Sandra Plum came up the driveway in her cardigan, holding her phone against her chest like a trophy. She looked at the chief, then at Marcus. then back at the chief, still wearing the expression of a woman who expected to be congratulated. "I am the one who called it in," she announced. "I saw him at the door with a tool. I knew he did not belong here. Good job getting out here so quickly." She glanced at Marcus with the particular look of someone who has never once questioned whether their instincts might be wrong. The chief opened his mouth. Marcus raised one hand just slightly. Stokes stopped. Marcus turned to face Sandra Plum. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said very calmly, "Good evening. My name is Marcus Webb. I purchased this property 3 weeks ago. I moved in on Tuesday." Sandra blinked. Her smile faltered. She looked at the chief, then at the house, then back at Marcus. "That is impossible," she said. "The Hendersons moved out. I did not see moving trucks. My relocation was arranged privately due to the nature of my work," Marcus said. He took one step toward her, not aggressive, simply present. "And you are the individual who initiated the emergency response." "I thought you were a burglar," she said. Her voice had lost its brightness. "Because you saw a black man crouching at a door with a tool," Marcus said. "That has nothing to do with it," she said quickly. "You bypassed any non-emergency inquiry?" Marcus continued, his voice level and precise, as a legal argument delivered to a jury and escalated directly to a 911 dispatch, providing a description of a crime in progress based on no evidence other than what you observed through your binoculars. Your assumption facilitated a civil rights violation that resulted in my physical injury on my own property. Sandra's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Chief Marcus said without looking away from her, "Please ensure this woman's information is recorded. I will be subpoenaing the 911 dispatch audio tomorrow morning. She is now a material witness in a federal inquiry, and I intend to explore civil litigation against her for initiating a false report that directly caused my injuries." Sandra made a sound that was not quite a word. She looked at Stokes. Stokes looked back at her with an expression that offered her nothing. "I suggest you retain counsel," Marcus said. "You will be hearing from my office within the week." Sandra Plum turned and walked back across the street. She walked quickly. She did not look back. Her curtains drew shut behind her and did not open again that night. Marcus looked at Cole. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was standing by the patrol car. The confidence that had filled every line of his body earlier in the evening had evacuated completely. He looked like a man who had stepped off a ledge and had not yet hit the ground. "Officers," Marcus said quietly. "Get off my property." Cole moved immediately. Pruitt followed. "Not you, Chief," Marcus said softly as Stokes turned. Stokes stopped. Marcus gestured toward the open front door of his house, where the keypad now glowed a quiet, steady green. "You and I," Marcus said, "have a great deal to discuss." The interior of 14 Weston Terrace was a sharp contrast to everything that had just happened outside. It was still partially in the unpacking stage, but what was visible was spare and deliberate hardwood floors, high ceilings, a few framed photographs leaning against the wall waiting to be hung, a bookcase that had been assembled and filled before almost anything else in the house. The scent of fresh paint and cedar lingered in the air. Stokes stood in the foyer like a man waiting for sentencing. Marcus walked to the kitchen without speaking, filled a glass of water, and took a long, deliberate drink. He did not offer the chief anything. He did not invite him to sit. He walked back to the dining room, rested both hands on the glass-topped table, and looked at Warren Stokes. Mr. Carmichael Stokes began. "My name is Webb," Marcus said. Stokes caught himself. "Mr. Webb, I want to assure you personally that Officer Pruitt will be suspended without pay, effective immediately. By tomorrow morning, I will have his badge on my desk." Marcus tilted his head slightly. Do you think I care about Dale Pruitt? The question was delivered without heat, which made it more unsettling than anger would have been. Stokes said nothing. Do you think Marcus continued stepping slowly around the edge of the table that removing one officer from the street solves anything? The data from your department tells a different story, Chief. In the 3 years since you took full command of the Internal Affairs Division, use of force complaints have increased by 39%. Your traffic stop disparities are statistically indefensible. Your Internal Affairs Unit clears 96% of civilian complaints without any disciplinary action whatsoever. He stopped moving. Pruitt is not an anomaly, Marcus said. He is the result of a culture that was built deliberately piece by piece over the years you have been in that office. He felt entirely comfortable doing what he did tonight because he has done versions of it before, many times, and nothing happened. Stokes's jaw tightened. Sir, with respect to tonight was an isolated incident of poor judgment. Marcus's voice cracked just slightly, just enough to communicate that his patience with that particular line had reached its limit. Do not insult my intelligence, he said. Stokes went quiet. I was dispatched to Harlan County by the Ohio Attorney General because your department's record flagged at every meaningful threshold. I have been reviewing your internal data for 3 months before I moved here. Marcus reached into his jacket and placed his phone face up on the table. That is a draft of a preliminary injunction I was preparing to file next month. Stokes stared at the phone, the way a man stares at something he would very much prefer not to be real. Tonight Marcus said you gave me something I was not planning to have. He picked up the glass of water and took another slow sip. You gave me first-hand irrefutable physical and recorded evidence of a constitutional violation committed against a federal officer by members of your department. His eyes locked onto Stokes's. And there is something else I want you to think about, Chief. I know about the Kessler report. The caller left Warren Stokes's face with the swiftness of water draining from a tub. His hand moved to the edge of the table. He gripped it. How he started. How could you possibly? I am the Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Director, Marcus said simply. I do not announce myself. I come through the floorboards. The Kessler report had been in that locked drawer for 18 months. Stokes had convinced himself that it had stayed there, that the small circle of people who knew about it had understood the arrangement. I was already preparing to use the Kessler findings to compel your resignation through legal channels, Marcus said. In a few months, quietly, with minimal disruption. He set the glass down. But that timeline has changed. Stokes exhaled a ragged, unsteady breath. Let me tell you what is going to happen, Chief. Marcus straightened. Pruitt is terminated tomorrow morning. Not suspended. Terminated. I will personally file criminal battery charges against him with the district attorney. You will not intervene. You will not protect him. He held up a second finger. You will immediately implement the Civilian Oversight Board that the City Council has been requesting for 2 years. You will grant them full subpoena power over your Internal Affairs Division. Stokes flinched. The Union will never accept that. Let them refuse, Marcus said immediately. Because if they do, the third condition goes into effect without negotiation. Tomorrow at noon, I hold a press conference on my front lawn. I release the body camera footage from tonight. I release the 911 audio. I release the full findings of the racially biased traffic stop data. And I release the unredacted Kessler report detailing how you, Chief Stokes, concealed evidence of felony theft by 2 of your senior captains. Stokes grabbed the edge of the table with both hands. His chest heaved. You're dismantling my department, he said. His voice was hollow. I am performing a necessary removal, Marcus said. the kind that should have happened years ago. He walked to the front door and opened it. The cool night air moved through the foyer. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow to deliver the termination papers and sign the oversight agreement. If my phone does not ring by 8:01, I call the press. I call the FBI, and I make sure that every camera in this city is pointing at this building. Stokes moved towards the door slowly, with the gait of a man carrying something very heavy. He stopped at the threshold. He looked at Marcus. "I thought I was doing what was necessary to keep the department functional," he said. "I thought loyalty to the people around you was part of the job." "Your job," Marcus said quietly, "was to protect the public. You forgot the difference. Good night, Chief." He closed the door. The keypad clicked. The light turned green. Stokes walked down the driveway. Pruitt stepped forward from beside the patrol car, his face tight with a hope that had nowhere solid to land. "Chief," he said. "What did he say? Are we okay?" Stokes stopped. He looked at Dale Pruitt. He thought about the 17 complaints. He thought about the card he had watched Pruitt slip into his vest pocket. He thought about the 8 years of protection that had produced this exact moment on this exact driveway. He held out his hand. "Give me your badge, Gary," he said, "and your weapon." Pruitt stared at him. "You're done." Cole stood 3 feet away. He did not say anything. But later, much later, when he was asked to describe the expression on Dale Pruitt's face in that moment, he would pause for a long time before answering. He would say that it was the face of a man who had always believed the rules did not apply to him, finally understanding that they did. The precinct was mostly empty at 3 in the morning. The fluorescent lights in the bullpen hummed with a low, persistent tone that seemed to vibrate through the floor tiles. It smelled of stale coffee, an institutional cleaner, that particular smell of a building that never fully sleeps. Chief Warren Stokes sat at his desk. Across from him stood 4 men. Dale Pruitt, stripped of his duty belt but still in uniform, pacing the length of the small office with the energy of an animal that could not accept confinement. Ron Vickers, union president, heavyset and red-faced, wearing the expression of a man whose entire professional purpose was to prevent exactly this kind of situation, and was now watching it unfold in real time. Captain Doug Farrell, one of the 2 men most deeply implicated in the Kessler report, leaning against the filing cabinet with his arms crossed, saying nothing, watching everything. And Officer Nathan Cole, who had been told to stay because Stokes needed a witness to what was discussed, and because in some part of the chief's mind he had not yet examined clearly, he suspected Cole might be the only one in the room he could not afford to have go unmanaged. Stokes had just finished laying out Marcus Webb's ultimatum. He watched the reactions move through the room like weather. Vickers was the first to speak. "You are telling me," he said, his voice low and disbelieving, "that you are going to let one man from the AG's office walk in here and dictate our personnel decisions based on a bruised wrist and a hurt ego." "It is not a bruised wrist," Tommy Stokes said. "It is false arrest, battery civil rights violations, and a federal officer who is here specifically to look for this kind of thing. He has the body camera footage. He has the 911 audio." So, what Pruitt said. His voice had a dark, restless edge. He paced to the window and back. "I responded to a 911 call. The neighbor reported a burglary in progress. I acted on that information. Any reasonable review is going to find that I followed protocol." "He doesn't need a reasonable review," Stokes said. "He has the FBI on speed dial, and he's not just threatening you." He looked around the room. He knows about the Kessler report. The air changed. Captain Farrell, who had been as still as furniture up to that moment, stood up straight. He knows Stokes said softly everything. The silence that followed was the silence of men recalculating every assumption they had made about how safe they were. Vickers recovered first, though his color was not good. That report was buried, he said. There is no chain of custody, no disclosure he cannot prove. He can release it, Stokes said. He told me directly. If I do not deliver Pruitt's termination papers and sign the oversight agreement by 8 a.m., he holds a press conference at noon and releases the unredacted audit to every media outlet in Ohio. Farrell said, his voice very quiet. If he releases that report, Doug Greer and I are looking at federal indictments. Stokes looked at his hands. And I am looking at 5 to 10 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The room absorbed this. Vickers rubbed his face. Farrell sat down heavily. Cole stood near the door and said nothing, watching. And then Pruitt stopped pacing. He stood still in the center of the room. The stillness was different from the kind Marcus Webb practiced. Pruitt's stillness had a compressed, unstable quality, like something about to break. No, he said. The word was not loud. It was almost quiet. But it stopped everything. No, I am not going to be the one who takes the fall, so that you and Farrell can walk away clean. Stokes, he said, 2 years ago, the night before the federal audit, you and Farrell sat in squad car 12 for 45 minutes. You talked about how you were going to alter the evidence logs. You thought the dashcam audio was off. He looked directly at Farrell. I was the officer who checked that vehicle back into the motor pool that night. I pulled the memory card before I signed it in. I have had it in a safe deposit box ever since. The breath went out of the room. Farrell physically stepped backward, hit the filing cabinet. You recorded us, he said. I took an insurance policy, Pruitt said. His mouth had curved into something that was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who has been cornered and has decided to make the cage as painful as possible for everyone inside it. Here is how this goes, Chief. You do not fire me. You tell Marcus Webb to take his ultimatum and his press conference and go back to Columbus. If he releases the Kessler findings, I release the dashcam audio of you and Farrell committing a felony. If I go down, I take the entire command staff with me. He looked around the room. Do we understand each other? He did not wait for an answer. He walked to the glass door, opened it, and walked out of the office. The door rattled in its frame as it swung closed behind him. The room was silent. Cole was still standing near the door. He had not said one word since he walked in. Vickers let out a slow, long breath. Well, Bob, he said, looks like you're wedged in from both sides. Stokes looked at the clock on the wall. It was 4:15 in the morning. He had less than 4 hours before Marcus Webb's deadline. He looked at his hands on the desk. They were shaking. He had spent 9 years building something. He had told himself it was a department, a team, a community institution. He understood now, sitting alone in the humming fluorescent light at 4:15 in the morning, exactly what he had actually built. At 7 a.m., Stokes called Marcus Webb's personal line and asked for a 48-hour extension. Marcus said no. The deadline holds, he said. Stokes hung up. He sat for 20 minutes. Then he called Farrell and told him the situation was beyond management. Farrell called his attorney. Stokes made the decision to comply. He spent the next hour preparing Pruitt's termination papers. His hands were steadier than he expected them to be, which surprised him. Perhaps because the decision itself, once made, had a clarity that nothing about the preceding 12 hours had possessed. He signed his name to the termination. He called the city attorney and began the process of implementing the oversight board. He did not call Pruitt. He did not call Vickers. He drove to Weston Terrace alone. Meanwhile, Dale Pruitt had spent the early morning hours doing what cornered narcissists do. He had called a reporter at the Harlan County Ledger, a man he had used before when he needed a story shaped a certain way. He had fed him an account of the previous evening in which Marcus Webb had become volatile and threatening, in which the officers had acted in good faith on a legitimate 911 call, in which a powerful man with political connections had leveraged his title to bully the chief into silencing two officers who had done their jobs. The article went live on the Ledger's website at 7:45 in the morning. Pruitt's name was not in it. His fingerprints were all over it. Marcus Webb read it at 8:02, sitting at the kitchen table in a perfectly tailored navy suit, a cup of coffee cooling beside a stack of legal folders. He read the article once. He read it again. He set the phone face down on the table. He looked out the window at the quiet Weston Terrace morning, at the oak trees with their October leaves half golden, and the driveways of his new neighbors catching the early light. He had been certain Pruitt would do something like this. He had not known the exact form it would take, but the profile was unmistakable. Men who had operated without consequence for 8 years did not simply accept consequence gracefully. They rewrote the story. It was the only move they knew. Marcus had simply waited for Pruitt to make it, because now the article existed. It was time-stamped. It was on record. It was the last piece he needed. At 8:54, a black SUV pulled into his driveway. Marcus watched from the window as Warren Stokes walked up the path. The chief moved like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. His shoulders were forward. His face was gray. He was carrying a manila folder. Marcus opened the front door before Stokes could knock. The chief held out the folder. "Here it is," he said. Pruitt's termination papers signed, and the oversight board agreement signed by me and the city attorney. "We have met your conditions." Marcus looked at the folder. He did not take it. Instead, he held up his phone and turned it so the chief could see the screen. It was the Ledger article. Stokes squinted at it. As he read, what was left of his composure left him. "No," he said. "I did not authorize this. Your man, Marcus, said went to a reporter this morning to paint himself as the victim and me as the aggressor. Our agreement was absolute compliance and silence, Chief. Not silence from you. Silence from your department." Pruitt broke that, which means the agreement is void. Stokes looked at him. Something moved through his face that was not entirely calculable. It was somewhere between desperation and the beginning of resignation. "I fell on my sword," he said. I pushed Pruitt's termination through. "I signed the oversight agreement. I gave you what you asked for." "You did not fall on your sword," Marcus said. "You ran out of options." Stokes stood in the doorway. "What are you going to do?" he said. His voice was almost inaudible. "What I came to this county to do," Marcus said. "I suggest you go back to your precinct and call a very good lawyer." He closed the door. The keypad clicked. Green. At noon, the driveway of 14 Weston Terrace was a different kind of place than it had been 24 hours earlier. News vans from Columbus. A crew from Cleveland. 2 national affiliates. Cameras on tripods. Microphones on a portable podium. State troopers along the perimeter. The neighbors of Weston Terrace watched from their porches with a collection of emotions that ranged from shock to discomfort to something that looked in at least a few cases like recognition. Sandra Plum's curtains were drawn. At 12:04, Marcus Webb walked to the podium. He wore a charcoal suit. He carried no notes. He let the cameras settle. He let the crowd quiet. Then he began. 3 days ago, he said, I moved into this house to begin my work as Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Director for the state of Ohio. Last night, while fixing a jammed lock on my own front door, I was detained without cause, forcibly restrained, and placed in handcuffs in my own driveway by officers of the Harlan County Police Department. A murmur moved through the reporters. He raised one hand. What happened to me is not the story, he said. What happened to me is a symptom of something that has been operating in this department for years, enabled by leadership that chose protection over accountability. He nodded to a technician standing beside a large monitor. The screen came to life. The doorbell camera footage was high definition and entirely clear. Every angle, every moment. The cruiser jumping the curb, Pruitt advancing with his hand on his weapon. Marcus's hands raised, calm visible. The moment Pruitt grabbed his arm, the shove against the hood of the car, the handcuffs, and then the audio. Pruitt's voice clean and unmistakable. The line he had said while Marcus's face was pressed to cold metal. Guys like you don't own houses like this. The press corps went very still. Then the 911 recording played. Sandra Plum's voice, steady, certain, entirely wrong. Marcus let it finish. Officer Dale Pruitt, he said the officer visible in that footage attempted this morning to publish a false account of last night's events through a local media outlet. He held up a printed copy of the Ledger article. He painted himself as the victim and me as the aggressor. He set the paper down. But Officer Pruitt is the least of Harlan County's problems. He reached under the podium and placed a bound document on top of it. This is the Kessler Report, an internal audit completed 18 months ago by this department's own auditor. It was handed to Chief Warren Stokes. Chief Stokes buried it. He tapped the cover. It documents the disappearance of $67,000 from the Harlan County Police Department's evidence locker traceable to 2 senior captains and Stokes' command staff. The press corps erupted. Marcus raised his voice just enough to carry over it. Effective immediately, he said, I am filing federal civil rights and criminal battery charges against Officer Dale Pruitt. I am handing the Kessler Report to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I am petitioning the Ohio Supreme Court to place the Harlan County Police Department under immediate state receivership. He looked directly into the main broadcast camera. The people of this county, he said, have filed complaints, documented incidents, lost cases, and been told that the system was working. The system was not working. It was being protected. He paused. Last night, 2 officers told me with their actions, if not their words, that a man like me could not own a house like this. They were wrong about that. But what they revealed in proving themselves wrong is that many people in this county have encountered that same assumption without the credentials to fight it. Those people deserved better. They still do. He stepped back from the podium. As he did, 4 black federal vehicles rolled slowly past the end of Weston Terrace, heading toward the precinct. The cameras tracked them. By 2 in the afternoon, Dale Pruitt was in handcuffs on the driveway of his own home in Ridgemont Heights. His neighbor across the street recorded it on a phone. The detail was not lost on anyone who had watched the previous night's footage. Pruitt did not say anything as the cuffs closed around his wrists. He looked at the concrete. He did not look at his neighbor's phone. By 3:30, Captain Doug Farrell walked into the lobby of his attorney's office building and found 2 federal agents waiting for him. He sat down heavily in one of the lobby chairs. His attorney was on the phone trying to negotiate a surrender arrangement. There was nothing to negotiate. By 5 in the evening, Chief Warren Stokes was walked out of the Harlan County Police Department by 2 federal marshals. He did not resist. He did not make a statement. He looked straight ahead as he went through the door and did not look back at the building he had run for 9 years. By 6, Ron Vickers released a written statement through his attorney announcing his resignation as union president, citing a desire to focus on personal matters. The statement contained no apology. It contained a great deal of legal language. His attorney had already been in contact with the FBI field office for 2 hours, and at 6:15 a process server knocked on Sandra Plum's door on Weston Terrace and handed her a certified notice of federal civil complaint. She signed for it with a hand that was not entirely steady. She closed the door. She stood in her foyer with the document in her hands and read the words "Federal Civil Rights Complaint" 4 times. The curtains stayed closed. Nathan Cole had driven to the FBI field office in Columbus at 4 in the afternoon. He had not called ahead. He had not consulted an attorney. He had driven for 30 minutes in his personal car in plain clothes and asked to speak to the agent assigned to the Harlan County matter. He was shown into a small conference room. He sat down. He placed his hands flat on the table and began to talk. He talked for 3 hours. He described every patrol he had done with Dale Pruitt. He described the pattern of stops. He described the neighborhoods Pruitt targeted, the reasons he manufactured the language he used in the car before they arrived, and the language he used at the scene, and the way the paperwork afterward never quite matched what Cole had actually witnessed. He described the moment Pruitt pocketed Marcus Webb's credentials card. He saw it happen. He saw Pruitt's hand move. He saw where it went. He said nothing at the time, and he had been asking himself since then whether there had been a version of that moment where he said something and he did not think there was, but he wanted to say it on the record. He said it on the record. He described something else, too. 2 blocks before they arrived at Weston Terrace, Pruitt had run the license plate of the car registered to the address. Cole had seen him do it. He had asked Pruitt what he got back. Pruitt had said nothing notable, but Cole had watched his partner's face, and his partner's face had changed slightly after that run. Not surprise. Something else. A settling in, a decision being made. Cole told the federal agent that he believed Pruitt had known from the plate run that the vehicle was registered to a Weston Terrace address. He had known before he turned his lights on that whoever was at that house had a legal claim to be there. He chose to respond to the 911 call anyway. The federal agent asked Cole to write out a full signed statement. Cole spent 90 minutes writing it. When he was done, he slid it across the table and asked if he needed an attorney. The agent told him that was always a good idea. Cole said he understood. He said he would cooperate with everything regardless. He said he was not recanting anything he had just said, and he would not be recanting it later either. He drove home in the dark. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes. He thought about the 3 months he had spent as Dale Pruitt's partner. He thought about the ways he had found to tell himself that what he was witnessing was complicated, that he didn't have the full picture, that things would be different when he had more experience. He had known, not the way Marcus Webb knew things with data and documentation and 22 years of pattern recognition, but in the simple way that a decent person knows when something in front of them is wrong. He had known. He sat in his car and held that for a while. Then he went inside. The federal courtroom in Columbus was full for the first week of Dale Pruitt's trial. The case attracted the kind of attention that comes when a story has footage. The doorbell camera recorded everything. The body camera recordings filled in the rest. Nathan Cole testified on the 3rd day. He was 26 years old and visibly nervous, in a way that the courtroom seemed to find credible rather than suspicious. He spoke clearly. He did not embellish. He described what he saw. He described Pruitt's behavior in the car before the stop. He described the moment Marcus Webb identified himself and the moment Pruitt took the credentials card. He described the plate run 2 blocks before they arrived. The defense attorney was experienced and skilled. He worked to establish that Cole was a disgruntled junior officer seeking leniency through cooperation. He established that Cole had not intervened in the moment. He implied that Cole's memory was shaped by hindsight. Cole listened to all of it. When the attorney was done, Cole said, "I have not been offered any reduction or leniency. I came to the FBI voluntarily, and I did not intervene in the moment." That is true. I have to live with that. But what I described is what I saw, and I will not say otherwise. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Guilty. All counts. The federal judge was a woman who had spent 20 years on the bench watching cases exactly like this one fail to reach conviction for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence. She had prepared her remarks carefully. She told Dale Pruitt that the uniform he had worn was a trust. A trust that exists because a community agrees deliberately, voluntarily, to extend authority to certain individuals in the belief that those individuals will use that authority with restraint, judgment, and basic human decency. She told him that he had not used it that way. She sentenced him to 6 years in federal prison, no early release provision, permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification, no pension. Pruitt was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He looked at the floor as he walked. The sound of the cuffs was audible in the quiet room. It was the same sound that had started all of this. Warren Stokes accepted a plea agreement 4 weeks after Pruitt's sentencing. He pleaded to obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal a felony. He did not go to trial. He received 4 years of federal supervised probation, permanent loss of his law enforcement certification, a lifetime ban from public employment in the state of Ohio, and the forfeiture of his pension. He made no public statement. His attorney released 3 sentences on his behalf that acknowledged the seriousness of the charges and expressed a general regret. Captain Doug Farrell cooperated fully with the federal investigation. He provided testimony that exposed the full scope of how the evidence locker funds had been taken, hoved, and hidden. He received a 2-year federal supervision agreement in exchange for his cooperation, and resigned from the department on the day he signed it. Captain Gerald Greer, the second officer implicated in the Kessler report, was indicted separately. His case moved to trial. Ron Vickers was indicted on 2 counts of obstruction of justice for his documented role in suppressing 11 of Pruitt's 17 prior complaints. The police union was placed under state oversight pending a full governance review. Sandra Plum settled a federal civil complaint for $85,000. Her name appeared in the public court record. It would appear there permanently. She moved from Weston Terrace the following spring to somewhere no one on the street knew to ask about. 3 months after the press conference on the driveway, the first meeting of the Harlan County Civilian Oversight Board was held at the County Civic Center. The room held 300 people. Marcus Webb was the keynote speaker. He did not talk about himself. He talked about the 23 complaints filed against Dale Pruitt over 8 years that had gone nowhere. He talked about the people who had filed them, who had described what happened to them in careful, documented detail, who had been told that the matter was under review, who had waited for outcomes that never came. He talked about what it means when the system designed to hear complaint is operated by the same institution the complaint is filed against. He talked about what accountability actually requires. Not a single dramatic incident, he said. Not a man with a federal title in the wrong place at the wrong time. It requires a mechanism, a structure, a board with the power to compel testimony and produce consequences. He looked at the faces in the room. "You are that mechanism now," he said. "Use it." The board's first action the following week was to commission an independent review of every internal affairs decision from the previous 5 years. It took 8 months. The review found 31 complaints that should have resulted in disciplinary action and had been cleared without meaningful inquiry. 31. Actions were taken. Some things moved slowly. Some things would continue to move slowly for years. That was the nature of institutional change. It was not a single event. It was a direction. Marcus understood that. He had always understood that. On a cold January morning, 3 months after the night on the driveway, Marcus Webb stood on the porch of 14 Weston Terrace with a cup of coffee. He had fully unpacked by now. The framed photographs were on the walls. The bookcase was properly organized. The kitchen had the particular comfortable disorder of a place that was being genuinely lived in. A patrol car rolled slowly down Weston Terrace. Different car, different officers, young, professional-looking. The officer in the passenger seat looked up and caught Marcus's eye and raised one hand in a brief, neutral wave. Just a wave. Then the car kept moving, continuing down the street, doing exactly what a patrol car is supposed to do. Marcus raised his coffee cup slightly in response. He stood there after the car was out of sight and thought about the morning he had moved in. He thought about the sealed folder on the desk in the study. He thought about the 23 complaints that had gone nowhere. He thought about every city he had walked into over 22 years, every precinct he had audited, every institutional wall he had pushed against, and the fact that the walls always looked solid from the outside until you found the place where they were hollow. He thought about Nathan Cole, who would be testifying at Captain Greer's trial next month, and who had called Marcus's office last week not to ask for anything but simply to check in. He thought about what it had cost Cole to walk into that FBI office. He thought it had probably cost him more than anyone would ever give him credit for. Marcus finished his coffee. He turned toward the front door. The biometric keypad glowed green. It had been working perfectly for 3 months. He pressed his thumb to it. The door opened without hesitation. He stepped inside into the warmth. The audit was ongoing. The Oversight Board was meeting. The Federal Receivership Review was in its second phase. There was still work. There would always be still work. But this morning, on this street in this house he had lived in for 3 months, something felt different than it had on the first day. Not fixed, not finished, but different in the way that a direction feels different from a standstill. He had spent his career walking into places where people had been told that what was happening to them was not really happening, where the paperwork said one thing and the lived experience said another, and the paperwork always won. He had spent his career making the paperwork lose. What happened to him on the 4th day in Harlan County was not an accident. It was not an anomaly. It was the department revealing itself exactly as departments always do when they are certain no one important is watching. The difference was that this time someone important was watching. But that was luck. The 23 people who had filed complaints before him did not have that luck. They had the same experience documented with the same care reported through the same channels, and they had been left to carry it alone. The Oversight Board existed now because of all of them, not just because of one October evening on a quiet street. Because of all of them. Marcus Webb sat down at his desk in the study. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the next file. There was always a next file. He began to read. And if this story reminded you that accountability is not a single moment, but a sustained choice that the systems protecting us only work when someone refuses to let them not work, and that every complaint filed and ignored still mattered, still counted, still built toward this, then share it. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, because the next person who files a complaint deserves to know that someone before them refused to accept silence as an answer. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. Stories where the truth is harder to ignore than the people who told it. He had started his career as a young attorney in the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, fresh out of Howard Law, 25 years old, certain that the law itself was enough. That if you built the right case, gathered the right evidence, made the right arguments in front of the right people, the outcome would follow. It took him about 3 years to understand that the outcome was never automatic. It had to be constructed. The same way a corrupt institution was constructed, brick by brick, decision by decision, protection layered on protection, until the whole thing looked so permanent that the people inside it genuinely forgot it had ever been built at all. You dismantled it the same way, brick by brick, decision by decision. The Detroit operation had taken 2 years. The commanding officer of the 3rd Precinct had run a protection scheme targeting immigrant-owned convenience stores and restaurants for 16 years. 112 families had paid. Many of them had also filed complaints. The complaints had been handled internally. Marcus had spent 14 months building a case from outside the department before he ever walked through the door. By the time he did walk through the door, he knew more about the department's operations than most of the officers who worked there. The commanding officer had looked at Marcus across a conference table with the absolute confidence of a man who had survived every previous challenge to his authority. He was indicted 18 days later. Marcus had not felt satisfaction at that moment. He had felt the particular kind of weariness that comes from understanding precisely how much destruction one man's unchecked authority can do to a community over 16 years. 112 families, over a decade and a half, each of them knowing that what was being done to them was wrong. None of them able to make the institution responsible for the wrong actually answer for it. He had carried that number out of Detroit with him. He still carried it. Baltimore had a different shape, but the same interior logic. The evidence locker theft there had been running for 9 years. The officers responsible had been so confident in their insulation that they had stopped even being careful. Marcus's audit had turned up the discrepancies in 3 weeks. The cover-up had taken considerably longer to document because the cover-up was several layers deeper than the original crime. It always was. The crime itself was often almost secondary. What really protected a corrupt institution was the network of decisions made afterward. The reports quietly altered the witnesses, transferred the reviews, conveniently truncated. Each decision made by someone who told themselves that they were not really doing anything wrong, that they were just being practical, that the cost of letting the whole thing come apart was higher than the cost of holding it together a little longer. Every single person in that network believed with what felt like genuine conviction that they were a reasonable person making reasonable choices under difficult circumstances. Not one of them thought of themselves as corrupt. That was the thing Marcus had come to understand most deeply over 22 years. Corruption did not require evil people. It required ordinary people making small accommodations one at a time until the accommodations became the institution itself. Warren Stokes was not a monster. He had probably been at 30 years old a genuinely decent officer. Someone who cared about the job. Someone who had watched the department he loved become something more complicated over time and had decided that keeping it functional was more important than keeping it clean. That decision, made once, had to be made again and again, each time a little larger, until the thing he was protecting had almost nothing in common with the thing he had originally wanted to protect. Marcus had seen it many times. He did not feel sympathy for Stokes, but he understood the shape of the story. Understanding the shape of a story was not the same as excusing it. It was, in fact, the exact opposite. Because if you understood how the story was built, you could also understand what it took to make sure the same story did not simply reassemble itself in a different precinct in a different county under a different name. That was the work. Not the arrest, not the press conference. Those were moments. The work was the structure that came after. The Harlan County Civilian Oversight Board held its 3rd meeting in February. Marcus attended but did not speak. He sat in the 3rd row and listened. The board was hearing a complaint from a woman named Darlene Okafor, 43 years old, a high school history teacher who had been stopped while driving home from a faculty meeting 9 months ago before the oversight board existed. She had been questioned for 22 minutes without any stated reason for the stop. Her vehicle had been searched without her consent. Nothing had been found. She had filed a complaint with the department's Internal Affairs Division 6 days later. The complaint had been cleared. The case had been reviewed as part of the Oversight Board's retroactive audit. It now sat in front of the board with a full investigative record, including radio logs, body camera footage, and the names of the 2 officers involved. Marcus listened to Darlene Okafor describe the stop. She was a precise and careful speaker, a habit of her profession. She had written down what happened that night within 2 hours of getting home while it was still clear. She had documented the time, the location, the officer numbers, what was said, what was done, the order in which it happened. She had done everything exactly right, and the first time around, none of it had mattered. The board listened without interruption. The chair asked several pointed questions about the internal affairs review process. The officer responsible for that review had been one of the 31 cases flagged in the retroactive audit. He was no longer with the department. At the end of the session, the chair announced that the case would proceed to a formal disciplinary hearing for the 2 officers involved. Darlene Okafor nodded once. She said thank you. She said it very quietly, the way people say things when they have been waiting a long time to say them and are not entirely certain even now that the saying has reached somewhere real. Marcus watched her walk out of the room. He thought about the 9 months between the filing and this moment. He thought about what it had cost her to file the complaint, knowing the record of what happened to such complaints, knowing the likelihood of the outcome filing it anyway. People like Darlene Okafor were the reason the work was worth doing, not because they were exceptional, because they were not. Because they were ordinary people, teachers and accountants and tradespeople who encountered something wrong on an ordinary day and refused to simply absorb it and move on. That refusal, repeated enough times in enough documented, persistent, consistent form, was the only thing that ever actually moved an institution. The FBI agent, the federal director, the press conference. Those were the visible moments. But the thing that made those moments possible was 23 people who had filed complaints that went nowhere and filed them anyway. That was the origin of everything. The Kessler report was formally entered into the federal record in March. The auditor himself, a quiet, methodical man named Gerald Kessler, who had been transferred to a records management position after delivering his report to the chief, testified before the Federal Oversight Committee in April. He described what had happened with the evenness of someone who had spent 18 months processing a particular kind of professional disappointment, and had arrived at something that resembled, if not peace, at least clarity. He had done his job. He had delivered his findings. He had been transferred and the findings had been buried. He said it all without visible bitterness. When he was asked how it felt to testify now, to have the report finally public, and in front of a federal body, he paused for a moment. He said it felt like a room he had been locked out of, finally having its door opened. He said he wished it had not taken what it took. The committee chair thanked him. Kessler straightened his papers, stood and left. Marcus, watching the proceedings from an observer's seat, made a note to ensure Kessler received a formal acknowledgement from the Attorney General's office. It was a small thing. But small things were how institutions communicated what they actually valued. In April, Marcus walked into a meeting with the newly appointed interim chief of the Harlan County Police Department. The interim chief was a woman named Patricia Moreno, brought in from the state's oversight office with a background in department reform. She had a direct, evaluative manner, and the particular quality of someone who had no personal stake in what she was being asked to dismantle and rebuild. She simply wanted to understand what had happened, and what would need to be true for it not to happen again. Marcus liked her immediately. He spent 2 hours with her. He walked her through the data, the complaint history, the stop disparity patterns, the ways in which institutional culture becomes invisible from inside it precisely because everyone inside it has adapted to treat it as normal. He talked about Nathan Cole. Moreno had already read Cole's testimony. She asked Marcus what he thought should happen with him. Marcus said he thought Cole was a young officer who had understood something wrong and had not acted on that understanding until circumstances made it impossible to avoid. He said he did not think Cole was a bad person. He thought Cole had not yet been in a position where the cost of acting differently than everyone around him was survivable. He said the question was whether Cole would become the kind of officer, now that he had experienced the cost, who made different choices going forward, or whether he would find a different set of accommodations. Moreno said she had the same question. Marcus said, "The only way to find out is to give him the context that makes different choices possible. Not protection, not leniency. Context, policies that are clear, oversight that is real, a culture that does not reward what Pruitt's culture rewarded. Put a person who genuinely tries to be decent into that context and they have a fighting chance. Put them into what this department was, and you get what this department produced." Moreno nodded. She said she had a lot of work to do. Marcus agreed. He said that was a good sign. Departments that believed the work was already done were the ones he worried about. On a Thursday morning in May, Marcus was in his home office reviewing depositions when his phone buzzed with a news alert. The Ohio legislature had passed by a margin of 73 to 27 a state-level police accountability bill that required all departments above a certain size to establish independently governed civilian oversight boards with full subpoena power. The Harlan County Civilian Oversight Board was specifically cited in the bill's findings as a model for minimum structural requirements. Marcus read the alert. He set the phone down. He looked out the window at the Weston Terrace morning. It was a warm May. The oak trees had fully leafed out. A child was riding a bicycle down the sidewalk on the opposite side of the street. He thought about what had happened last October on this driveway. He thought about the sequence of decisions and accidents and deliberate choices that had led from there to here. Pruitt's decision to run the plate. His decision to stop anyway. The click of the handcuffs. Cole's decision to drive to Columbus. The Kessler report sitting in a locked drawer for 18 months and then sitting in the federal record forever. And 23 people who had filed complaints that were ignored and filed them anyway. None of it was inevitable. Every step along the way there had been a version of events where things went differently. Where Marcus Webb was someone without a federal title, without a 22-year career and a sealed manila folder on his desk. Where Dale Pruitt's gamble that the world would treat his victim the same way it had treated his previous victims turned out to be correct. That version existed. It had existed for every one of those 23 people. That version was the default version. The version where it turned out differently required an enormous amount of work and an uncomfortable amount of luck. Marcus Webb had been both the work and the luck. That was not a satisfying conclusion, but it was the honest one. The work going forward was to make the structure less dependent on luck, to make accountability something that did not require a federal title to access. That was the point of the bill. That was the point of the board. That was the point of the slow-grinding, unsexy institutional work that had no press conference and no footage and no dramatic moment. That was the work he came back to every morning. He picked up the phone. He called the Attorney General's office to begin coordination on the implementation framework. On a warm June evening, 6 months after the night on the driveway, Marcus Webb walked to the end of his driveway to retrieve his mail. A woman was walking her dog past the house. She was one of his neighbors, a woman named Carol, whose last name he had only learned recently, who had lived on Weston Terrace for 12 years. She paused when she saw him. She said hello. She said she hoped he was settling in well. Marcus said he was. He said the neighborhood was very quiet. She nodded. She said something he would think about later. She said it feels different now, doesn't it? The neighborhood. After everything that happened, Marcus considered. He said different how. She took a moment. She said like it has to be something now. Not just a nice street. Like the people on it have to actually decide to be neighbors, not just people who live near each other. Marcus looked at her. He thought about Sandra Plum. He thought about the neighbors who had come out onto their porches with their phones that October night. The ones who recorded in horror. The ones who watched in satisfaction. The ones who had not quite known what to do. He thought about what it meant to live near someone versus what it meant to be accountable to them. He said, "I think you're right." Carol said goodnight. She walked on down the street. The dog looked back once at Marcus over its shoulder, then lost interest and continued on. The house at 14 Weston Terrace had come fully to life by summer. The desk in the study was buried under depositions and audit files and the kind of organized paper chaos that signals genuine engagement with work. The kitchen smelled of coffee in the mornings and something cooking in the evenings. The doorbell camera, mounted by the front door, continued to record as it had always recorded quietly without announcement, without any particular drama. Just watching, capturing whatever happened to happen. On an ordinary August morning, Marcus stepped onto the porch in the early light with a cup of coffee and stood there listening to the street wake up. A car backed out of a driveway 2 houses down. A sprinkler started somewhere around the corner. A bird landed on the edge of the porch railing, regarded him for a moment with the sideways evaluation of a small animal, deciding whether a large one poses a threat, and then decided it did not and flew away. The biometric keypad behind him glowed green. The front door was unlocked. The coffee was hot. The audit on his desk would take another 2 weeks to complete and would result in a 70-page report that would be read carefully by the right people and acted on with appropriate deliberateness over the following months. There was a long road. There was always a long road. But Marcus Webb had been walking long roads for 22 years, and he had learned something that he had not known at 25-something, that no amount of law school had prepared him for. The road was the work, not the destination. The road. The complaint filed and ignored and filed again. The audit buried and recovered and put in the federal record. The board that met every month and heard every case and moved with imperfect and frustrating but genuine deliberateness towards something better than what came before it. That was not a story with a single dramatic ending. It was a story that kept going, because the people in it kept deciding to keep going. That, in the end, was all it ever was. People deciding one at a time that the next day was going to be different from the day before. Not because the system guaranteed it, because they refused to let it be otherwise. The federal indictment of Ron Vickers moved through the courts with the particular grinding patience of a process that knows it will eventually arrive where it is going. Vickers had spent 9 years as union president operating under the assumption that his role was fundamentally protective. He had believed with the sincerity of a man who has constructed a worldview out of professional necessity and held it long enough to mistake it for conviction that protecting officers from complaints was the same as protecting the public from injustice. That internal accountability was always the province of the institution itself, never of the people the institution was supposed to serve. He had run the union grievance process like a law firm, efficient, technical, relentlessly focused on the letter of the contract. Every one of Pruitt's 17 complaints had crossed Vickers' desk in some form. He had reviewed each one. He had identified the procedural weaknesses in each filing. He had applied the union's resources to ensuring that the departmental review process produced the outcome the contract entitled his members to seek. He had cleared 17 complaints filed against a man who had slammed people against hoods of cars, called people names that stripped them of their humanity, run stops in neighborhoods he had decided were his personal hunting grounds. Vickers had told himself that the process had worked. Standing in a federal courthouse in Columbus at 54 years old, he understood perhaps for the first time what the process had actually done. He accepted the plea. 2 counts of obstruction, 5 years federal probation, permanent removal from any union leadership position. He read the statement his attorney had prepared and signed it. He did not add anything of his own. His attorney said this was wise. Vickers was not sure whether wisdom had anything to do with it. He thought it might simply be exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that settles into a person when they have spent years maintaining something that should never have required that much maintenance. Nathan Cole was reassigned to the Community Liaison Division under the new interim chief's reorganization. It was not a punitive reassignment, though some of his former colleagues described it that way. Patricia Moreno had been deliberate in her reasoning. Cole had demonstrated in her assessment a willingness to choose accountability over loyalty, at the precise moment when that choice had cost him the most. She wanted to see whether that was character or circumstance. The Community Liaison Division worked directly with neighborhood associations, school programs, and local organizations to build the kind of relationships between residents and law enforcement that might make the next Sandra Plum reach for her phone to call a neighbor before she called 911. It was not glamorous work. It was not the work Nathan Cole had imagined for himself when he graduated from the academy. But he was good at it. He was 26, and he understood something that a lot of officers in their 20s did not. He understood what it felt like to stand on the wrong side of a situation, and to know it and to do nothing. That understanding, sitting inside him like a piece of glass, was not comfortable. But it made him a better listener than almost anyone else in the building. He could hear in the concerns people brought to him the shape of things that had happened to them before. The times they had reported something and nothing happened. The times they had decided it was not worth reporting because they already knew what nothing happening felt like. He could hear that, and he stayed in those conversations. He did not make promises he could not keep. He said instead that the process was different now and that he was part of that process, and that if they brought something to him, he would carry it forward, and he would tell them exactly what happened to it step by step. He meant it. That was new. The Ohio Accountability Bill that passed in May generated considerable discussion in departments across the state. Some chiefs welcomed it. Some chiefs greeted it with the practiced compliance of people who had learned that visible resistance to oversight created its own problems. A few departments that had their own versions of the Kessler Report sitting in their own locked drawers made quiet, voluntary disclosures to the State Oversight Office in the weeks following the bill's passage. Marcus's office handled several of those referrals. Each one was its own story. Each one had its own cast of people who had filed complaints. Its own history of accommodations made in the name of pragmatism. Its own network of protections that had to be mapped and dismantled piece by piece. Marcus worked through them with the same methodical care he had brought to every case in 22 years. He had built a team around him in Harlan County, 4 investigators, a data analyst, a community liaison coordinator. He trusted them. He had worked to be worth trusting in return. That was how institutions rebuilt. Not through declarations. Through sustained, daily, ordinary effort, in which the people inside the institution made choices that were visibly consistent with what the institution claimed to be. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that generated press conferences. It was the kind of thing that over time changed what a precinct smelled like from the inside. Whether the people in it believed when they clocked in that they were part of something worth being part of. That was the measure. Marcus had seen enough departments in enough cities to know what a healthy one felt like from the inside. It felt like accountability was possible. Not guaranteed, not automatic. Possible. That was enough to build toward. There's a question people often ask when they hear a story like this one. They ask, what does it say about the system that it took a man with a federal title to make the system work the way it was supposed to work? It is the right question, and the honest answer is that it says something troubling about how accountability is distributed. The 23 people who filed complaints before Marcus Webb moved on to Weston Terrace did not lack courage. They did not lack clarity. They did not lack the ability to describe precisely and accurately what had happened to them. They lacked the structural mechanism that would have made their clarity matter. Marcus Webb had access to a mechanism. He had spent his career trying to build mechanisms in places that lacked them, so that the next person who needed one would not have to arrive with a federal title in their pocket to access something that should have existed already. That is the work, not the single dramatic case. The infrastructure, the board, the audit, the independent review, the subpoena power, the transparent reporting, the clear policy, the culture that makes it possible for Nathan Cole to drive to Columbus on a Thursday afternoon and give a statement that costs him something real. That infrastructure does not generate footage. It does not produce the kind of story that ends with a press conference on a sunlit driveway, but it is the thing that determines whether the press conference was a beginning or just a moment. In Harlan County, it was a beginning, because people decided it would be. Because Marcus Webb moved into a house on Weston Terrace and refused to accept that what happened to him should simply be absorbed and set aside. Because Nathan Cole drove to Columbus. Because Gerald Kessler wrote a 50-page report and delivered it knowing what was likely to happen to it, and then waited 18 months and testified when the door finally opened. Because 23 people filed complaints in a system that was designed not to hear them and filed them anyway. That is what it looks like when a community refuses to look away. Not a single extraordinary act, a series of ordinary ones made by ordinary people at ordinary cost, sustained over years, until the structure of things finally had no choice but to change.